Hello everyone and welcome to MicroOcean, the podcast that shines a light on the unseen world beneath the waves. We're three undergraduate biology students and a few months ago, our English teacher introduced us to a project she wanted to launch, taking part in International Ocean Day. The idea was simple. Each of us had to create something meaningful, something with real impact. The guidelines were wide open. We could choose our topic, our format, our approach with just one requirement. Everything had to be ready by May 22nd. At that point, all we really had was a vague project and a deadline. The real challenge was figuring out what we actually wanted to do with it. That's when an idea arose. Thinking back to our prokaryoology classes and the microorganism we study, we remembered a lecture where our professor explained that bacteria can colonize almost every environment on Earth, except inside the volcanoes. Which led us to a simple realization: the ocean is far from devoid of microbial life. And given how resilient these organisms are often said to be, we began to wonder, could they, too, be at risk in oceans so often described as fragile? As it turns out, they are. Not only are marine microorganisms under threat, but they also play a crucial role in maintaining the balance of marine ecosystems. Their vulnerability is therefore a serious concern. We were genuinely surprised by this discovery. But more importantly, we realized we had found the foundation of a real project, a cause worth exploring, rooted in knowledge we already had. When we shared it with our professor, she herself hadn't fully grasped just how threatened marine microorganisms are. So we decided to raise awareness, to help more people discover this largely overlooked part of the biosphere. And what better way to do that than through a podcast? That's how MicroOcean was born. And today, in this very first episode, we're excited to take you a little deeper into the ocean's invisible world.
Before talking about the microorganism that may be endangered, I'm going to tell you a bit about the way the ocean functions to better understand what the dangers are. The ocean is not just a gigantic blue area. It's a complex thermodynamic machine that regulates the climate on Earth. It absorbs a huge part of the carbon dioxide produced by the human activity. But that machine would not be able to work without its biological engine, microorganism. And that's where our story begins. Although the ocean is huge, the majority of its life is microscopic. It's estimated that marine microorganisms represent more than 98% of the living biomass of the ocean. That's a gigantic quantity. What's more, microorganisms, and especially phytoplankton, are responsible for at least half of the oxygen production on Earth. This means that half of the air that you're breathing right now comes from those minuscule creatures. Without them, our atmosphere would be very different. But their role doesn't end there. Microorganisms are the foundation of the marine food chain. Krill, little fish, whales, and everything depends directly or indirectly on those microbes. They recycle nutrients, transform dead organic matter into reusable elements, and recycle carbon and nitrogen. Actually, they are the invisible engineer that maintains the equilibrium of the planet. However, this apparent resilience is an illusion. Those ecosystems stand on a very fragile equilibrium. A minor variation in temperature and acidification, even minuscule due to the absorption of CO2 or the presence of chemical pollutants, can disturb the entire chain. What threatens microorganisms threatens the ocean as a whole, and by extension, our own survival. I am now going to let Amandine speak.
Hello, so I am Amandine, and now I'm going to talk more specifically about the importance of microorganisms through a fascinating example, coral reefs. When we think about these reefs, we immediately imagine an explosion of colors, fishes, corals, in short, an incredible visible diversity. But in reality, what we see is only the surface, because there is also an invisible world, the world of microorganisms. Coral reefs are home to hundreds of thousands of animal species, and each of these species is covered with a microbial flora called the surface-associated microbiome. This microbiome is made up of bacteria, archaea, viruses, and microeukaryotes. It is extremely diverse, abundant, and above all, unique. Indeed, studies have compared samples of open ocean water with those taken directly from coral reefs. The result is that the microorganisms found in these reefs are not widely distributed across the Pacific Ocean. In other words, they are found almost exclusively within the reef itself. Each coral reef therefore becomes a true microcosm with its own specific and irreplaceable microbial communities. So much so that, according to some estimations, the microbiomes associated with reef animals could represent up to 2.5% of all prokaryotic diversity on Earth. That is enormous, especially when you consider the microscopic size of these microorganisms. The surfaces of reef animals are therefore much more than simple outliers. They are true reservoirs of microbial biodiversity. But these microorganisms are not randomly present. In most cases, they live in symbiosis with their host, that is, in a mutually beneficial relationship. Let's take a concrete example: marine sponges. The microbes living on their surface play an absolutely crucial role. They help with nutrient assimilation, allowing the sponge to feed efficiently. They also contribute to its reproduction, chemical defense, human system, and even its resistance to pathogens and environmental stress. In short, these microorganisms are essential to the survival and proper functioning of their host. And yet, despite their importance, these microbes are still poorly studied. Only a small fraction of existing species have been described so far. Today, this balance is in danger. Climate change, particularly ocean warming and acidification, as well as human pressures such as pollution and overfishing, are causing rapid degradation of coral reefs. It is estimated that up to 10% of corals and reef fishes could disappear. But behind this visible loss, there is another, much more discreet, and potentially even more serious. The disappearance of reef species also leads to the loss of their associated microorganisms. This means that thousands of microbial species, often unique and sometimes still unknown, could disappear irreversibly. And the problem is that we don't know yet fully understand their role. Their loss could therefore deeply disrupt the functioning of reef ecosystems, without us being able to fully measure all the consequences. Faced with this, we might feel powerless, but there are simple actions at our own scale that can help preserve these microorganisms. For example, reducing local pollution by limiting the use of plastic that ends up in the ocean. We can also pay attention to the products we use, especially sunscreen, by choosing so-called reef-safe versions that do not contain substances harmful to coral microorganisms. And of course, adopting responsible behavior at sea. Do not touch corals, even lightly. Avoid disrupting the sand, as it can smother microorganisms, and respect these fragile environments. These actions may seem small, but combined, they have a real impact. In conclusion, coral reefs show us something essential. Even the smallest organisms can play a huge role. Understanding and protecting these microorganisms ultimately means preserving an entire ecosystem, both visible and invisible. I am now going to let Yuna speak.
So hi, I am Yuna, and today I'm taking you into the world of an organism that is as tiny as it is fascinating, Prochlorococcus. This photosynthetic marine cyanobacterium measures barely 0.6 micrometers, essentially invisible to the naked eye, and largely unknown to the general public. And yet, its impact is immense. Prochlorococcus lives throughout the world's oceans, with a particular affinity for tropical waters. What makes it remarkable is its ability to harness sunlight to produce energy through a process you're already familiar with, photosynthesis. And like plants on land, this process releases oxygen. This is where things become truly striking. Comparing such a microscopic organism to a tree might sound like an exaggeration, but it's not. In fact, Prochlorococcus is found across roughly 75% of the ocean's surface, with concentrations reaching up to 1,100 cells per milliliter of seawater. As a result, it is responsible for about 5% of global oxygen production. In other words, some of the air you're breathing right now comes from these microscopic ocean dwellers. At this point, you might be wondering, why worry about Prochlorococcus? After all, it relies on sunlight, a resource that isn't running out anytime soon, and it produces something we depend on directly, oxygen. On paper, it seems like a perfect system. But there's a catch. Despite its apparent resilience, Prochlorococcus is now under threat. Climate change is disrupting its delicate balance. And if this organism were to decline, the consequences wouldn't be limited to its own survival. They could ripple outward, affecting all of us who unknowingly rely on its invisible work. For a long time, scientists believed that Prochlorococcus would adapt easily to warming oceans, especially since it already thrives in tropical environments. But that assumption is now being challenged. While this cyanobacterium grows best between 19 and 30 degrees Celsius, it struggles to tolerate higher temperatures. Climate models predict that within the next 75 years, some ocean regions could exceed 30 degrees. As a result, estimates suggest that Prochlorococcus activity could decrease by anywhere from 10 to 37%, depending on the model used. Alongside this decline, scientists also expect a gradual shift in its distribution, with populations moving towards the poles in search of cooler waters. And this is far from trivial. In many tropical ecosystems, cyanobacteria form the very foundation of the food web. Their decline could therefore destabilize entire ecosystems, because while we often think of these microorganisms primarily as oxygen producers, they are also part of the plankton, the very first link in the marine food chain. Put simply, without them, ocean biodiversity as a whole could be affected, potentially with far-reaching consequences. And that's not all. These organisms don't just produce oxygen. They also absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. For this reason, they are known as carbon sinks, playing a key role in regulating the composition of our atmosphere. To understand why this matters, it helps to remember a basic principle. Humans, like many animals, consume oxygen and release carbon dioxide as a waste product. Without natural processes to rebalance these gases, CO2 would gradually accumulate in the atmosphere, leading to catastrophic consequences. Fortunately, photosynthetic organisms, both on land and in the oceans, absorb this carbon dioxide and release oxygen, maintaining a balance that is essential for life. But if the activity or abundance of cyanobacteria like Prochlorococcus were to decrease, that balance would be disrupted. Less CO2 absorbed means more carbon dioxide dissolved in the oceans, which accelerates acidification, a phenomenon that is already a major concern today. And in turn, ocean acidification threatens a wide range of marine species. In short, behind these organisms, completely invisible to the naked eye, lies a role that is absolutely fundamental to the functioning and stability of marine ecosystems as a whole.
To summarize this episode, I want to come back to this central idea. The invisible is crucial. We saw today that marine microorganisms are not just details in the immensity of the ocean. They are the motor of life, the lungs of the planet, and the recycling of our resources. Their diversity guarantees the ecosystem's resilience, but that resilience has limits. The threat that we talked about, global warming, acidification, pollution, are not so distant. They already have an impact on the microscopic population. If the microorganism disappears or changes, it's the food chain as a whole that will collapse, from plankton to whale and us with it. Yet, there is still hope. By better understanding their functioning, reducing our carbon footprint, and limiting pollution, we can help the ecosystem return to its equilibrium. The protection of the ocean starts by recognizing what's happening to it, even at the smallest scale. Thank you for listening to us. Don't forget, protecting microorganisms is protecting the ocean, and it's protecting our future. Every action counts, even the smallest. Stay connected for the next episode of MicroOcean, where we'll interview Héloïse Lebras. Before then, take care of yourself and of the planet.